All right, we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. If for the people that are watching this live, if you wanted to go ahead and just introduce yourself and tell us where you're from, and we'll just go ahead and for those people that are watching it offline, you may want to fast forward a couple of maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and we'll get a bunch of questions collected. So we'll go ahead and do that. But if you have questions for the live use, you could enter them in the comments field. We're going to let people get logged in. So if you're watching this live, there's no need to type in a message to introduce. If you're not watching it live, you don't have to introduce yourself. Comments will kind of get lost. But and just feel free to enter any of your questions in the comments field. We had some people that emailed some questions in advance, and we'll go ahead and get started here. We'll get people logged in and get started in just a couple minutes. Okay, so we have Holland, Lithuania, UK. We have Quebec. We have Tony Ray Jones from Nashville. Good to see that you're on. We have Jean Pierre from London. Once again, my name is Greg Ondo. I'm actually presenting from Northern Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C. area in the United States. Switzerland, Trevor, UK, Israel. All right, so we have some questions coming in. It's Senegal, Atlanta, Toronto, Argentina, Geneva. All these places I want to visit. All right, we have India, Mexico. We have Taiwan. We have Oklahoma City. We have Vancouver. We have Connecticut. We have Granada in Spain. I've been there. It's a beautiful place. We have Germany, Poland. We have Portugal, Massachusetts. All right, so we have some questions on Groove Agent 4. If there's any, I just saw a comment. If there's any particular questions on Groove Agent 4, you just type it in the comments field, but we could talk about it. All right, we have Pittsburgh. Okay, just copying questions are coming in. Thanks for all the great questions from everyone. All right, so we have Romania, Pittsburgh, Russia. We have Wales. We have Rome. Okay, so see question on the transport bar, how to enable, disable that. We'll get that. All right, so see a question, what is today's topic? So generally what we do with the Hangouts is just answer questions. So any questions that you have, you could type in and we'll go through those, and people have sent questions in advance. So it's really just kind of a Q&A series. So there's no specified topic other than the questions you guys submit. Right, we have Peru. We had someone just switched from Pro Tools and Logic is to Cubase, and they're loving it, they say. From Ben Monroe, I believe. So the question, if we could discuss feature improvements. So yes, you could definitely kind of ask the questions about feature improvements. A lot of times when people ask for feature improvements, sometimes the features already do exist. Okay, so we have Bucharest. Cameroon, just copying over some more questions. Thanks for all the wonderful questions from everyone. All right, we have Colorado in house. Beautiful state. We have Cash. Good to see you from, I believe it's Mauritius. I'm probably saying that completely wrong. Or Chicago in the house. All right, so I see a question. Do I prefer to run Cubase on Mac? I run it both on Mac and PC, and I just go back and forth all the time. The Google Hangouts have an audio problem, or they did at one point on Windows 10, so that's why I kind of use Mac for all the Hangouts. Okay, still copying over questions are coming in. Thanks for everyone's patience. All right, we have Taylor from Pine Grove, Pennsylvania. All right, we have Daryl from Pine Grove. I think we just became LinkedIn, if I'm not mistaken. And Fort Washington's right across the river from where I live. Okay, a bunch of questions are starting to come in. We got some from Poolsville. I believe that's Maryland. We have Brazil, New Jersey, Washington. Right, Massachusetts. All right, so we had a question from someone who's a beginner, asking if this is for beginning topics or advanced. It'll probably cover both, but there's a chance some of it may go over your head, but you could always pick up tips and tricks. I think we had just a little pause, a little lull in questions being submitted. All right, so I see a question on why Steinberg broke virgin territory automation. So maybe if you could expand on that. All right, so I think we have a lot of questions submitted. Let me just take. Okay, so I see the kind of clarification on the virgin territory. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for your patience while we're collecting all the questions. Okay, so one question that we had come up kind of repeatedly is how to be able to hide the transport zone in 9 or 9.5, and it's just going to be Alt Control or Command Control T. So if you just kind of directly come here, so I think it's Alt Control on the Windows platform, Command Alt or Command Option T, and that will take the transport zone from the bottom here and be able to hide that. And you can still have the floating transport by opening up F2, but that's the keyboard shortcut for the transport. So just Alt Control or Command Option T. You can see the bottom transport just kind of open up just like that. All right, so we had a question. Is it possible to get audio statistics? Let's see, for the whole track. Just reread the question here. As if all the clips were merged. Um, I think the audio statistics will kind of work on the selected audio file. So if you had multiple audio files on a particular track, what you would probably need to do, let me just open up a different project here, some more audio. Um, so if I come directly here, we'll just open up in our project. And if we had multiple audio files submitted, and if you're not familiar with this concept, so if I come here, let's say if I just dragged a drum loop or something on top of a particular file here, and then at that point, what we can do is there's a function where you could say, okay, let's just do the audio statistics. And when I come directly to my audio menu, and this is something that a lot of people kind of miss, is how to quickly find like the loudness and information on a particular audio file. So I believe that this is going to be based on the track, and let me just see if that is for a particular track. So let's say if I added a particular if I add a new track of audio, and we'll just make a stereo file, and let's say at this point I did my audio statistics for that particular drum loop, you can see that we'll have that settings. And if I wanted to go to, let's say, another sample library, something a bit more maybe atmospheric with different volume levels, if that changes it, if it's for the selected track. So now we go to our statistics. If I select all the events, we'll see if we get different settings. So as you can see, if you have multiple parts selected, the audio statistics will go and show you on a per file basis. So if you wanted to have the statistics for a particular track, you could just simply, if you wanted to see that in one single window, take these two files, select it, and you could do something like a bounce selection, turn that into replace that file. You'd have one file which you could do, and this may kind of defeat the whole purpose, but now if you do the statistics, it would be for all of the files on that track, but they are kind of merged. So it will show you each statistic differently. If you want to see it for the overall track, you could just simply merge those two files like so. Okay, so we had a comment just on keeping particular tabs in the inspector visible. So I think someone wanted to see their fader. Let's just read this correctly. fader and quick controls, always visible. So if you come to the inspector, you could just kind of come here and you could pick and choose exactly what functions are and aren't included. So if I just wanted to come here, you could even just kind of go to your setup. And I think if we go to your setup here, so let's say if I wanted to see my quick controls, and if I hold down, and let me just hide some more of these. So you could just kind of right click and we'll show you another way to do this. But in a question was, I want to see my fader and my quick controls. Okay, so we have. So at this point, you have just the fader and your quick controls. But if you right click here, you can go to the setup. And I believe there's a way of pinning. Um, so if you actually just kind of click here to pin those particular ones. So again, we could just kind of right click. And then you could choose to just kind of have those particular ones. I believe pinning it will, keep it in control. But now as I go to, different tracks here, once that's set up and I save it as my template, I could just simply at that point have just my fader and my quick controls active. So if you kind of right click on a particular track, make sure that if you get, if you only want to see those particular things, but if you click on the setup, try on the visible items to pin the item to exclude it from automatic closing. And I think that may do the trick for you. So I'll just real quick reset all these and go back to our normal values like so. All right, so we had a question, double clicking in. It says by default, if you double click, that it creates a MIDI track as opposed to an audio track. Let me just. Okay, so just a question: if we double click here, that it will create a MIDI track as opposed to just an audio track. And I believe it's saying in the track list area. I'm going to reread the question. Okay, so I believe that you're saying maybe if you let me just do like a new project here. So if I just double click here, it'll default to MIDI track. But if I have an audio track, so I don't know a way to just automatically have it turn into, I think some previous versions that you could double click and have it add an audio track. Let me just see. If you, it looks like if you hold down the shift key and double click. So let's say if I'm here at the bottom track, or let's say just in the blank area. I had it with the just a double click. So if you hold down, I'm on the Mac. But if I come here and I double click while holding down the command, then it might be control on PC on the bottom track. So if this is selected, or if I just go to the bottom here, I can't recreate it. But it looks like maybe holding down a modifier key will do that. But a lot of people can just assign, just a keyboard shortcut. So when you go to project, you could just, add an audio track. Let me just see if I get it recreated here. So if I had it where it double clicked. So if you just double click with some of the modifier keys. So I just double clicked with my command key held down and it just popped up to add audio track by default. Okay. Just read through some of our questions coming in. All right, so we had a question about which algorithm to use for for individual tracks on a project, like if you're doing, different time stretching type of edits. Um so there's different algorithms that you could have for different types of functions. And we could see the algorithm directly here from the info line. So you can see the algorithm here. So by default, it may be just standard mix. These are some of the older algorithms. I believe these might have been introduced in SX2 or SX3. So I believe it was SX, maybe SX1 or SX2. So these would allow you to change, and we see kind of material for drums, and it's going to be more rhythmically based. For plucked instruments, we have kind of more transients. We have ones for pads, vocals, mix. Uh, Probably most people would find higher quality algorithms with the Elastic Pro algorithm. So you have time, pitch, and tape. So you have time, that's going to be for more rhythmic material. So I may do more drums and percussion for time. For pitch, I might do guitars, keyboards, bass, vocals. Tape is if I wanted to simulate a tape machine where if as I slow down, it would actually change the pitch of the audio like an analog tape machine. And then you have where you could have formant preservation as well as kind of efficient. So I find that probably most people would kind of gear towards the Elastic Pro algorithms. Would probably give better overall success if you're doing especially large amounts of time stretching to maintain kind of the quality of the audio. So, and again, you can find that directly here. Also in the pool. So if we go to the pool window, you could also see kind of the algorithm, directly here. So it's going to, by default in the pool, each file will be set to kind of Elastic time or Pro. So, you could set the same algorithm for a number of different tracks here, just kind of holding down the shift key and changing them all to one particular algorithm. And you may find that different projects, different types of projects may lend themselves more to different types of stretching algorithms. So you can kind of play around with that, but probably I would lean by default to the Elastic Pro algorithms. All right, so let's go through some of the comments here. There's a lot of comments sneaking in. Okay, so the question is, let's say I have a 1 hour recording and I wanted to break out each song individually. So let's say, for instance, it was a live recording and maybe it kind of looked, let's say, something like this. We'll just duplicate. So what you could do is, one of the things that you could do is, let's say if I wanted to, this was a live recording and I wanted to now treat each individual song as a separate file. I could go in with my range selection tool and find kind of the start and end points. Then I could hit the letter P. That will move the left and right locators around that part. And then if I just wanted to select all the events here, at this point I could go to range. And then at this point, let's say I just go to edit. Just say if I have this range selected here, when I go to my range, I could split. So now I've split, let's say, song 4. Then what I could do is, at this point, I'm going to take this and I will just go to edit and we're going to select, and I'll just invert the selection and hit delete. And at this point, what I could do is just say I want it to back up project. So this would actually, and once I do a backup project, this will automatically save those new files into the new folder. And at that point, what you want to do is to then you could save that project as a different name, maybe like, live concert and the name of the song, something like that. And when you define a new folder at that point, only those particular files, once you do this, so let's say if I create a new folder here, you'll be asked to say, okay, I'm going to choose open. And at this point, you could choose just to minimize the audio files. And once that has been chosen, only the files used in this project will be copied over. So what I would do again is just simply come here to select the range, with my range selection tool. And you can just do that globally. And then go to your edit to range and choose to split. And you could actually probably make a macro to do this pretty easily. And at that point, go to select, invert selection, delete those events, and then and again, create, or just go to file to backup project. And then choose to minimize those audio files. And then you have a project that's just that one particular song out of a whole selection of a live set. And you can treat that independently. So that's probably the easiest way. And you could easily set that up in a macro, I think, so you don't have to do 6 steps if that takes too long for you. Okay, so we had someone mentioned that they need switchable scaling for meters. So if you come here, you could actually see different metering types here. Sorry about that. It's annoying. And here on, as part of 9.5 or as part of the control room, you could actually set kind of your full digital scale here. And depending on your metering types, you could, set whether you want it to be minus 18, minus 20, minus 24. If you go to your loudness meters, this shows you your loudness units, and we could think of that as RMS. In the mix console, you could also just simply come here to your meter settings. So if you go to your global meter settings, you could just choose how much that you want it to be, the metering position as well. So there's a number of different metering options that are available directly from here. So you can see kind of loudness units for broadcast or for streaming services, or different metering scales all laid out for you here. So I think, depending on what metering scale you use, you can often adjust kind of different uh, calibrations of your meters as well. So that'll probably give you more accurate method for your metering. And if you wanted to also getting in touch with meters, if you go to your preferences, I know a lot of people, once they go to the metering type and go to your metering appearance, that you could assign different colors for different meters as we go here. Now, earlier versions of Cubase sometimes had, was at +6 dB for meters and would go +6 dB. But if you go to just for the project setup, here you could actually choose what the actual metering scale will be, I believe. Let me see if we can just find it here, if it's going to be +6 dB or so here you could choose whether you want the top scale to be +6 or +12 dB. So there's a lot of different metering options that are available inside of Cubase. All right, so we got a question about a control room insert won't open plugin. So let me just take a look at that, see if I could recreate that. So as soon as I come here, let's say if I just wanted to do compressor on my control room. So that seems to be working fine on my system here. Um, I'll try it in a Q mix as well, so we get kind of the same type of behavior. So that all seems to be working as expected. So if I'm doing something differently than what the question was, just let me know and I could try it again. So I see a question: when will Cubase 10 be out? So Cubase 9.5 just came out in November. So they're usually kind of on a yearly release schedule. This one actually came out a bit early. But it's probably not going to be imminent, so it's 9.5 is still fairly a new version. So I don't know when 10 will be coming out, but um according to precedent, it usually is about a year for each new version is kind of what's been going on, but I can only speculate as to what's would happen in the future. All right, so we had a question: is it possible to remove multiple plugins from an insert? So let's say I think maybe it might be dealing with, let's say if we have different plugins on a particular insert here. I know if you come here, that you could if you just click on, so it looks like if we just come here, you could bypass the inserts. And if you hold down uh the option or probably alt on PC and click that, you could now just reset all the plugins, all the inserts on that particular channel. So again, if I come here, let's say I just wanted to come here and I have multiple plugins going on. So it looks like just Alt or Option and click there. You could reset all of the inserts if you have 16 inserts you want to get rid of without having to do each one individually. Um, so we see that I see a question. I get this a lot where if you wanted to come here to see all the different Steinberg instruments that you needed for third parties. I'm not sure why it doesn't do that, or if it's maybe perhaps a lot of the third party companies aren't doing VST3 as well. But currently, this is set to Steinberg instruments. I'll pass on that feedback again to our planning team, but I've expressed that already to them in the past. I see a question: when will we be able to do kind of free warp on multiple tracks on the project window? That currently isn't available. I know that it's been on some user surveys that Steinberg has done, so I imagine that it will probably be coming. I haven't heard any plans of when that feature will be implemented or if it'll be implemented, but I know that the planning team is aware of the issue. I've expressed to them as well. Okay, so someone's asking, they want to use a panner on on a mono track. Um, so I don't think it's any problem. Just going to reread the question. Um, so it's if I just come here. So the question is, they want to use a panner on a mono track, and I see this question a lot, and I don't understand it. It's just these are all mono tracks here. If I go directly above here, I see the panner, which I could freely pan to the left or right channels. If I go to my inspector, I could pan my channels accordingly, just like that. So whether it's stereo or mono, I could still pan without having to create a stereo group. So uh, maybe if I'm misunderstanding the question, you could leave a comment in the field, and we'll see what. But I hear that question a lot, and it just kind of confuses me because seems pretty easy to do, but maybe I'm misunderstanding. All right, so had a question: whenever you load in a plugin, the user interface doesn't automatically pop up like it used to, and I believe this is just a preference. So if we go to preferences, um, uh, so it's probably if you go to preferences under VST. Sorry about that. So annoying. And go to plugins. You'll see the second preference here is open effect editor after opening it. So that will probably do the trick. So once again, go to your preferences in Cubase under VST to plugins and make sure that open effect editor after loading it is enabled. And I think that will solve that issue for you. If not, let me know. I see a question: will there be a Linux version of Cubase soon? I haven't heard of any plans for that. So I know there's a lot of people that use Linux, and we understand kind of the need for it. But I haven't heard of any plans. for a Linux version of Cubase. I see that the person says they want to leave Windows and Mac, and I can understand the frustration. But I currently there's no plans for it that I've heard. I'm just reading through questions coming in. Okay, so question, we kind of get this every hangout. Why is there no longer 32-bit plugin support? We've been doing the 64-bit plugin support for let me see, almost 14 years. So we realize that there are still some plugins that are 32-bit enabled, but with version 9, we stopped supporting natively to bridge 32-bit plugins because they do cause a lot of system instability. We realize that some plugins the companies have gone out of business, and they're very, and they're kind of a go-to solution or a tool. So what you can do if you need to run 32-bit plugins, I think you could get a third-party bridging solution like JBridge. I think it's $30, and a lot of people still have success running legacy plugins. But again, it does pretty significantly degrade your overall system performance and system stability bridging plugins that are probably 15 plus years old. But if you need to do it, just simply go out and get a third party bridging software. We didn't block that capability. We just no longer internally bridge 32-bit plugins. I see the question is 8 gig of memory enough? It really kind of depends on what type of project you're doing. If you're doing 24 tracks of audio, you could probably squeeze by with 8 gigs. Where memory sometimes can be used heavily in a program like Cubase is when you start getting into virtual instruments. If you're doing 3,200 tracks of virtual instruments and trying to replicate a symphony orchestra with tons of different samples, so working with software samplers that will take more memory even if they are streaming from disk than if you're just doing straight audio. So depending on the type of work you do, more RAM could be more beneficial for, if you're a composer dealing with large sample libraries versus someone that's just recording 16 or 24 tracks of audio and mixing. So it really depends on your workflow. If 8 gigs of RAM, I'm right, my two laptops that I do my demos on, I run 16 gigs of RAM, and my personal studio machine is kind of older. I have 24 gigs. And I find that that's a pretty good balance. If you have financial constraints, the more RAM the better. But you could definitely do work with 8 gigs of RAM. All right, so we have some people checking in from Ireland and Latvia. We had a question: how can we get? Someone said that their samples and their loops disappeared from the MediaBay. So probably what you need to do is if you just go to your MediaBay here, and let's say if you go to user content, or if you have files on your computer, what you could actually do is just kind of go here and let's say, okay, I have a bunch of drum loops in this particular folder. Just make sure that that folder is checked to start with. And if not, you could just right click on the folder and choose to rescan the disk. Now, if you don't see this little area on the left-hand side, the file browser, just click in the lower left-hand corner, and now you can come right here and activate the file browser, and then find that folder where your loops are. First, make sure it's checked, and then right-click and make sure that you have rescan disk, and that should repopulate it back into your MediaBay. So occasionally, some folders will get unchecked for administrative, like, privileges, stuff like that. So try that, and they'll probably repopulate and be available in your MediaBay again. I see a comment. I would love to have match quantize back into Cubase, kind of like the earlier versions of Cubase. It's kind of interesting. I was just thinking about that myself. And match quantize, from this is going back to Atari days, where you could actually take like the timing of one track and apply it to another track. Really handy for getting like two different MIDI parts to line up. And one of the things that was introduced recently in Nuendo 8.1 was the ability to align different audio events, where you can kind of select one file and say align and click on the line audio events and then go back, and then you're able to just simply have those two parts lined up. And it's really handy for doing like post-production work, for matching up dialogue that's been re-recorded to the original dialogue. So hopefully we'll see some of that functionality come perhaps in future Cubase versions. But I like the old match quantize tool from my Atari days of Cubase as well. And I kind of miss it at times. So but I think we see some stuff in Nuendo that's kind of along those lines for audio as well. Okay, so we had a question, jumping back to MediaBay, of not being able to hear like different sound files, and where is that routed to? As I do this, it's going to be, so this is automatically routed through the control room. So if you don't hear like your previews in MediaBay, so even on the side here, if we just say, okay, I just wanted to go to, different drum loops here and listen to them. So, as you preview your different loops here, and that's all being routed through the control room. So, if you go to your VST connections in 9 and earlier, in 9.5, it was relabeled to audio connections. And now in previous versions, it was kind of confusingly labeled a studio tab. It's now called the control room tab. So if I just have my output set here, I choose to have my main stereo output as not connected. And then I choose to now route, and I just have, let's say, my Yamaha HS7 monitors, which is what we're kind of the bus that we're listening to. At this point, I have these set up into my main left and right output on my audio interface, my UR44. And at that point, we could now hear that. But if I disconnect it, that we wouldn't hear the control room preview. So just make sure that you go to your VST connections or audio connections, to the studio tab or control room tab, or it's kind of better named in 9.5, and that you have this set up. And if you have that set up, you don't want to kind of double bus or duplicate the signal path. So choose the outputs to not be connected. And then, as you do scrubbing, so if I come here and let's say if I switch my play tool to scrubbing, this also gets sent directly into the control room as well. So so make sure you have the control room active, and that should fix that issue for you. All right, so we had a question with all the new features implemented in Cubase 9.5. Does Nuendo have those features currently with the current versions? Currently, the new 9.5 features haven't been implemented into Nuendo. I'm not sure when that will be, but it will. That's kind of been the what's been happening. So they were at parity feature wise with Nuendo 8.1. Had all the features of Cubase 9, and I'm sure that there will probably be an update to implement the new features as well. That's the general philosophy of what they're doing with Nuendo, but it currently isn't there, so it takes a little bit of time. So just seeing a question if there's an easy way of dealing with different a global mute, how to undo that. Um, and I think probably the easiest way is just to use kind of the mixer undo. So I think that's the best way of doing it. So if you have 25 tracks muted and then you undid it, is to just kind of use the mixer undo, especially if it's automated. So that's the best way at this point. All right, so I see a question. How do I record a groove agent loop? So let's take a quick look at this. So I'll do a new project. So I'm going to add a VST instrument, and we'll add a groove agent SE. Okay, so there's a couple of different. So it says a groove agent loop. So I'll just load up a kit here. And saying that, it could kind of mean several different things. So let me just load up one particular pattern here. Okay, so let's say if I have like a drum loop here, and I'll just slow the tempo down, something a little more appropriate here. So let's say, all right, so as we kind of work with this, one of the things that you could do is, you could just sequence the particular note that triggers that pattern. So let's say if I have a MIDI part set up here, and we can see that this pattern, like G sharp 1, will trigger that particular pattern. So if I just scroll down, and let me just, okay, it's going to be G sharp -1. Sorry. So at this point, I could just draw in a note. And when I hit play, this note triggers G sharp 1, which is the pattern pad. So now if I just come here, it's going to just play back that pattern like so. So that will trigger the pattern that is then triggering the individual patterns here. So that's one way of doing it. If I wanted to trigger the individual notes that were being recorded, I could internally record that as well. So if I just wanted to come here, and what I need to do is to set my MIDI input from Groove Agent. And now when I hit record, and let's say if I go to my pattern pads, I'll just put on my click track. And then when I stop recording, so at that point, when I go to look at this particular drum part, I can just double click and we'll look at it in our drum editor. And now at this point, we could see kind of all of our different drum parts. So that basically recorded the output of what was being generated in that pattern as a pattern internally into Cubase. Now, the question recording a drum loop could also imply that maybe the particular pad itself had a drum loop. So what I could do is take a drum loop here and I could drag that drum loop directly to a pad and I could just trigger that particular note. So if I hit a C#4 note, it could play that drum pad for you. So that's another way. So I think one of those three methods should cover the question. If not, just let me know. But again, you could sequence the actual notes. So if I just wanted to, and again, I'll just come here to my set all. So as soon as I wanted to add a particular instrument here, I could record that internally, or I could actually just sequence the particular instrument here. So say if I just wanted to just trigger and these particular notes that trigger that in turn trigger the patterns. And those individual notes could also samples could include a drum loop as well. So I think that should go through different scenarios. If not, if you need a different type of situation, just let me know. All right, so just seeing that some of the modifier keys don't work on Windows, apparently. Let me just take a quick look. Okay, so saying that setting the Alt Shift on Windows doesn't work. I have a Mac currently up, but let me just try it out here. So let's say if I have 8 audio tracks and I want to set them all to the same output. So make sure that, one thing that a lot of people miss is to select all of the tracks, I think. And so let's say if I want to send these to my left output. So I just held down Alt Shift. And now, sorry, it's annoying Mac thing. They're all set to the same output. I think I've tried it on Windows and didn't run into any issues, but make sure that that all the tracks are selected. I will try it right after when I get my Cubase on PC again. After the Hangout, I could give it a try, but usually it's just, so give that a try, but make sure that they're all selected. So again, that's just like Alt or Option plus Shift. So I'll check to see if it behaves differently on Windows, but on the Mac, it seems to be kind of working. Usually something like that stops working. It stops on both platforms. But you know, but make sure that all the tracks are selected. Yeah, and someone else, and this is another Groove Agent scenario where if you wanted to take Groove Agent, and let's just take this scenario again. If you wanted to record it as audio, I see this kind of mentioned as well. So I'm going to just go ahead and erase this particular part, and I'll come here. So one of the things that you could do is also set up a kind of a phantom group channel. So if you wanted to pass it as audio, so at this point we could add a group track. Um, okay, so I'll just add a group track. So we could route this particular track, the audio characteristics of Groove Agent here. So as soon as I come here, this will be the audio out. And what I want to do is to send this particular channel. And I'll just move this out of the way here. And instead of the stereo out, I'm going to send it to my group out. I could also do it from a send if I wanted to. So now we have the audio going into the group when we play this particular channel. And now I could create a MIDI track, or let's say an audio track, and I want it to be a stereo audio track. And at this point, I could say, I'm going to arm the audio track and this MIDI track. And for the MIDI track, I want it to be set to my Groove Agent as my MIDI input. And now as I record, I could record both the audio and MIDI from the virtual instrument at the same time. So if I wanted to switch patterns, you can see the MIDI. And then so let's see if I so here what I want to do is set the input to a group channel. Sorry, operator error. So now the group channel is the audio input here. So as we play, I'll play this particular preset and now and arm the MIDI. So I'm recording both the MIDI and the audio simultaneously. So if you wanted to do a loop like that, that's another method to accomplish that, and you could pass it as audio. So I'm seeing a question. It's not necessarily Cubase related, but someone living in Switzerland that wants their default language for the newsletters to be in French, or someone moving from Japan to be in English. So I'll pass that on to the team. I'm not sure what algorithm they use to automatically determine languages for the newsletter, but I'll pass that on. Okay, so we had a question on drum map, how to change the grid to something like triplets for multiple or within the drum editor. So let's come here and so I'm just going to switch this to my drum editor. And I'm just going to kind of slide this over. So let's say I have these set to quarter note triplets. So, and let's say I have this set to like an eighth note triplet. So I think as I would paint in drums, so I'm not sure if it could be done globally, but as you kind of click in here, while the grid may not change, if you're just kind of painting in, so let's say if I wanted to do 16th notes here, I can now paint in 16th notes. If I say, let's do half note triplets. So even though the grid is kind of the same, as you go to paint in notes, they will still kind of be independent based on your snap value for each individual drum. So now if I want to do 16th note triplets, so that way you could have independent snap, and as you kind of program drums in just by turning the snap for that particular lane. And let me see if there's a way to change those uh globally somehow, if it takes effect, or there might be a way of changing multiple ones. Let me just I don't see I'm not getting a keyboard shortcut to do it. Well, you can't change it all, but each drum that you kind of do put in can have an independent snap. So as you go to draw in notes with like the drum editor, that you could just have those different rhythmic intervals automatically set up for you. All right, so we had a question. Will the make drum map from instrument work with Easy Drummer, or does it work only with Groove Agent? It works with, so if I come here, when you go to make the drum map, it's just part of a VST3 instrument, I believe. So I think that probably the Easy Drummer is still VST2. I'm not absolutely sure. But I think you'd need to be running the VST3 version. It's not necessarily, I don't think it's a Steinberg instrument, but that's a VST3 versus a VST2 instrument. Of why doesn't, with some drums, automatically create the drum map based on the data from the instrument itself. So you may want to just make sure that uh that you're, if you have the VST3 version of Easy Drummer, that you have that installed. I think it's a VST2 versus a VST3 issue. All right, so we have a question: how do you hook up a USB mic into Cubase? So it's really just kind of, once you have it set up, you want to go to your studio setup, And then when you get to your VST audio system, you may see kind of like a generic USB audio mic. And depending on the operating system, a lot of the USB mics are class compliant. So when you go to your device setup, in previous versions to 9.5, it was the device setup. But in 9.5 and later, it's actually going to be called studio setup. And from there, you would see under your VST audio system, you could choose to have your USB mic. Now, one thing to be aware of, sometimes Cubase doesn't like a lot of, if in some of the mics are only an input source and don't have an output source. Kind of the better USB mics will have an input and output for monitoring. So sometimes if it's just an input, Cubase doesn't like it because it's hard to actually clock the digital audio coming from it. And they're really kind of more for consumer based applications. So make sure that your USB mic, when you buy it, if you're buying one, has an output as well. And then once you have that defined in the studio setup under your VST audio system, you would see kind of your USB mic there. At that point, you could go to your audio connections and then set the input and output for your device in your directly here and inputs and outputs. All right, so we had a question. Is there a way, like with drum replacement, to audition the samples in kind of like a preview mode? Um, so if you have the full version of Groove Agent, you can do this quite easily. Some people use a sampler track for this. Um, but if you had just kind of MIDI notes, so let's say if I wanted to just go to my virtual instrument here and instead of using the Groove Agent SE, we're going to use the full Groove Agent. So, and let's say if you wanted to go through a bunch of kicks very quickly or a bunch of snares and kind of preview it. So I'll just load up a kit with some patterns here. Just find it same R&B. Okay, so right now, I just have this kit loaded up, and let's say I was just playing it back, and this could be like something that's been replaced. So let's say I go to my instrument here. All right, so we have my kick here. So I'm going to select that. And then when I go to load, I'm going to go to my browser. Now I could just kind of come over here. And then there's this little icon. So once you go to instrument, select the pad, click on load, then go to browser. And then you could just have this replace focused sample turned on. So I could just double click. I could scroll down. And then just hit enter. And that's how you could browse through samples really quickly. So once you kind of have everything set up as different patterns, you can now just kind of come directly there and find different samples, kicks and snares to replace it. And that could be whether it's, been generated as trigger notes or, whatever samples, lots of us have lots of kicks and snares throughout our entire, samples that we've collected over the years. And you could just scroll through and just, replace any kick or snare within your kit just that easily. All right, so seeing a question: how do you create your own flex phrase preset? And this is probably for Halion or Halion Sonic SE, and save it along with it. So let's say if I wanted to go to my Halion Sonic, the full version, not the SE version, I think has this. And then once you get into edit, you could get into, once you start getting into like some of the different editing functions at this point, you could have like different flex phrasers or like different arpeggiators. So let me see if I could probably find a preset, maybe like guitars. So if I just kind of load this up, and we can see uh you could activate kind of your, different flex phrases here. And I think kind of, these are going to be, uh, you know, tied directly to phrases that are going to be factory done. So I don't believe you could actually, from the flex phrasers, have a particular like load up your own phrase. If you wanted to do something like that, you could actually, if you wanted to do different flex phrases and make your own, if you have a particular pattern, what you could do is go to the chord pads, and then once you go to the setup in the chord pads, you could have different patterns, and you could import MIDI loops, or you could actually just kind of come here and, if you have a note, just some MIDI notes in a particular phrase here. So let's say I have this as a guitar part or an arpeggio, um, that you could drag drop a MIDI part from your project window directly onto the pads and be able to trigger those pads, which could include different flex phrasers. So you could have different guitar or like, Hammond organ licks or clavinet parts. So while the flex phrasers, I'm pretty sure are, kind of, factory locked, what you can do is have kind of a very similar effect using the chord pads. Okay, so I'm just reading a question from someone from Italy. So the question was setting the indicators, and I believe means the metering on the inserts. So if we have, let's say, like an audio track here, we go to the mix console, and you kind of right click and go to your meter settings. You have different meter positions. So if you want it to be input, you could also have it be post fader. So your input would be what the signal is coming in. Post fader would be after inserts, and post panner would be after the routing of it. So probably if you could have this set to default as post fader, and then I think that will indicate the signal flow of the insert, what's going on with the inserts as well. So give that a shot. I see a question why Cubase's chord track doesn't include power chords. Technically, from a music theory standpoint, a chord is 3 notes or more, and a power chord is 2 separate pitches. So I think that's why. I know some people call it like an A5 chord or an E5 chord, but I think the guy who worked on the chord tracks may be kind of an actual stickler for music theory. So technically, a chord track not doing a power chord is correct because it's only 2 pitches. So it's all right. We'll move on. Some questions. So I see a question: does Jade Bridge work with Cubase? Yes, it does. And I'm seeing another comment just on that Waves plugins are incompatible with Cubase. As long as they're 64-bit, I believe they're all compatible. If they're not, if they're like older 32-bit Waves plugins, which a lot of people still have, at that point you would need a bridging solution like JBridge. But any 64-bit VST plugin works with Cubase. We invented the whole protocol to do that. So, but so I believe if you're seeing like some Waves plugins, make sure that they are 64-bit, and if you have VST3, that's also helpful. Question: can we share different screens on different mixer, like having the mix console on a different screen? Yeah, I have a friend in Nashville actually has I believe it's 16. No, he has 9 different screens currently, or 11, I think he's up to now. So a lot of the windows, like the edit window by default, will kind of go to the lower zone. And this is something that's kind of introduced with 9. But any of the windows that are in the lower zone, if you click on this little arrow here, that will be an independent floating window that could be placed on any monitor that you have available in your system. So that's all you have to do. And if you're kind of came to 9.5 from 8.5, where everything opened in separate windows, if you go to your preferences, we can now, if and just go to editors, you could choose to double click opens it in the lower zone or in a window, or if you hit the keyboard shortcut, it could go and you could kind of toggle that behavior. So yes, you can have as many different monitors as you want with your system. But we've done a lot of work at users' request to have kind of a more optimized single window screen for people working with larger, high definition like 4K monitors, and even people working on televisions, large televisions in their studio or laptops, to kind of optimize the workflow for a single screen. So that's why we see this, but we don't want to, as soon as you work on a single screen, make it not work with multiple screens. I have 2 or 3 screens. I have 2 screens I primarily use for my Cubase, and one monitor that's dedicated for video in my studio. And I always have my mix console on one screen and my editors on one screen, and kind of spread out. So all right, so I see a question: are we going to be able to save plugin chains for the direct offline processing? I've sent that in as a user request as well. It was implemented into Nuendo, and sometimes when something gets implemented in Nuendo, it may show up in Cubase later. I haven't heard of any definitive plans or word on that, but I think it's something that may happen. But I haven't heard of any announcements for it. All right. So we had a question of not being able to open up the drum using drum notation. Let me just take a quick look. All right. So saying that you can't open the drum editor anymore. Um, so if I come here and let's say I go to my MIDI and go to my drum editor, that it always opens up, and it could be maybe when you double click on a part, we can see that that is going to go to our drum editor here. And within the drum editor, you can go to kind of the drum map setup. um so as soon as we actually let's say if I come here to my drum editor, you can go to the drum map setup, and here is where you could actually see the different notation parts. So, and then here you could choose kind of like the display note as well as the drum head shape for doing drum notation. So make sure that that when you come here, it just check, in where you go to load the drum map, that it's set correctly and that you have your drum map set up here, and make sure that that kind of makes sense. It may default to a general MIDI map. And if you're using a VST3 instrument like, Halligan or Groove Agent, you could just simply come here and have it automatically generate the drum map based on the event. So, but just check because it seems like that's all working as expected for me. So, just kind of going through some of the questions are coming in, and we'll get to some of the questions sent in and that were done earlier. Thanks for all the wonderful questions. Okay, so I just had a question about in the mix console that maybe clearing the EQs isn't working like how we did it earlier. So let's go ahead and give that a try. So I'll try it first on my inserts here. Okay, okay, so let me see if we can. So that will bypass it, and it looks like if we right click, that you could just clear and reset. But let me see if there's a keyboard shortcut for that. that we could find. So I know what some people would do is just simply save a preset with nothing loaded in. But let me just. I'll just try a couple more modifier keys here, see if I can. So if you, I'll play around with a little more, but if you right click, and it looks like you could just. Okay, so what it looks like if we just select this to bypass it and then hit the backspace key or delete, that will do it from the mix console level. So once you have that set up, you have a number of inserts, and you want to do it from the mix console level, select, then hit delete, enter, done. So that's how you can do it in a mix console. Sorry for the confusion. So question, is it possible to reset Cubase if there's any technical issues? When you start the program, you could actually hold down like Alt Control Shift or Command Option Shift. And then you have the option where there's a number of different preferences that are part of Cubase. And as you boot up, if you hold down Command Option Shift, you could temporarily disable the preferences or go back to the default preferences. So that's one way to kind of reset Cubase to kind of factory default settings if you want. Okay, so we had a question on uh, working with like different snap values and how they relate. So let's say I just have a drum loop in here, and I'm going to activate my snap here. So as soon as I come here, there's kind of different snap values. I could have it snap immediately to bar, so I can't move it in between. There's also, I can move it, just have it snap directly to beats. We could do that. We could use a quantized value. So if I wanted to do, eighth note triplets, I could have it snap to that. Or in 9.5, a really handy one is adapt to zoom. So depending on your zoom level, like if I'm zoomed at this level, we could snap to bar and beat. But if I zoom in, I could have it automatically snap to smaller intervals on a grid according to kind of my zoom resolution. So as I work with this, and there's also kind of different, events is here. So let's say if I have another event and I have that event here, I could actually kind of choose, I want to snap this to that event. So at that point, even if this event isn't is kind of in the middle, not necessarily on a grid. If I now have my snap turned on, I can now just have this event automatically snap to the border of that. Then we have shuffle mode. And I think what this is going to let you do is as soon as I move this in front, it'll just kind of flip those two. We could also do as a different snap type. We could choose grid relative. So at this point, I could just kind of snap between those two. So, and then you could have kind of magnetic cursor. So if my cursor is here in the middle, I could just have it snap like the end or the beginning. And this could also tie directly into, if I wanted to double click here, we could also have a snap point visible. So if we had a pickup note where it's like da 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 da, and the second note is what I wanted to snap to, I could just now move that snap point to the second beat. And as we do this, it'll snap based on that snap point. So those are some of the different modes of snapping and how they can work in kind of doing some really handy editing. So. All right, so we had a question on like a MIDI part, how to easily delete like pitch bend information, like MIDI controllers. There's several different ways. So let's say if I have a MIDI event here, I'll just add a MIDI track. And let's say on this MIDI track here, I'll just expand it out so I can have some more info. So let's say I have some notes, and then I had pitch bend info. And let's say I had aftertouch, and let's say I had modulation. So different types of. Let's just look at modulation here. Okay, so if you wanted to easily get rid of these, one of the things you can see is if you have a little asterisk, that means that you have events of that value. So you could select all of like your modulation events here and then hit delete. Some people will use a logical editor. So let's say if I wanted to come here, I'm going to go to my MIDI menu and say, let's go to logical editor. And at this point, I could say I wanted to delete types that are equal to MIDI controllers. So let's say I want to go to controller, and the controller that I wanted to do, and we'll say value 1 of a MIDI controller is going to be, let's say, our controller number. And then what I could do is at this point, I'm just going to switch this to let's say I have modulation. So at this point, I could set up a logical editor preset and just say, I just wanted to delete all of my modulation. Some people will go into the list editor and say, oh, there's a lot of aftertouch information here. And then you could actually just choose to say, let me just, and at this point you could see, where is the, There's a way you could just select all of. Just show all my icons here. So if you go to filters, that's what I was looking for. At this point, I could say we're going to select all the aftertouch, and I could say I want to select all of the aftertouch. So I could filter by the event types. And at this point, and I just did by select, I hit Control A or Command A and hit delete, and all of my notes would still be there without any of the controllers. So that's 3 different ways of getting rid of various MIDI controller messages pretty easily. Okay, so someone asked how to quickly create a drum map for for a sampler track where you only see the one particular drum map. So let's say if I just wanted to come here and let's say I just have kind of a kick. And what I want to do is just go make my sampler track. So now I could just come directly to my sampler track. And then if I wanted to just see the particular drum sample here on like C3, what you could do is at this point, it's just going to kind of show up as MIDI. And if you wanted to just select and see only the one particular drum sound, let's say if we have just a note on C3 and we're looking at this in the drum editor, all you have to do is there's kind of a masking. So if you go to the drum visibility agents, you can say show drum sounds only with the events on it, and then it will hide everything else for you. So once you have it in the drum editor, just go to the visibility agents and show sounds only with events, and that one sound, it will filter out from view the rest of the notes that aren't triggering that particular note from the sampler track. All right, so we had a question about kind of saving like a mixer, of making a template for the mixer. So let's say if you have like one project and maybe it's like a live thing, you want kind of the same basic settings for consistency. Um, so let's say if I just wanted to go to, let's say, a project like this where I have like, my bass and drums and guitars all dialed in how I want, and I want that same kind of consistent tone throughout the project. We just don't have that project there. Let me just open up another one. Just find a particular project here real quick. Okay, so there's a couple ways, and this kind of ties into another question that was emailed in about how to quickly make a template from an existing project. So let's say we have a number of different files kind of laid out for us here. And I have everything set up perfectly how I want in the mix console. So one of the things that you could do is if you actually kind of just click here, is you could actually just take the selected channels. So let's say I just wanted to take these channels and say, okay, these are kind of set up exactly as I want. And at this point, you could just go to your functions menu and say save selected channels. And that will kind of save, all of the different audio tracks are selected with their panning, with the effects on them, just like that. And then if you're going to another project and you want it, to sound the same as this project for consistency, you could just load the selected channels. Now, someone had emailed a question in about sending, how do I make a template? Like, let's say I'm in the middle of a session, everything is perfectly dialed in, and a band wants to go to song 2. So you could actually make a macro. And what I did is if you go to key commands, we can now just go to show macros. I created a macro that says build template from project. And you can do this manually if you want to, but really all you had to do is say go to your file menu and say save as new version. And then so that doesn't affect the original files. I do a select all and I go to delete all the files. I choose to remove the unused media, and then I save as template. So if I wanted to trigger this macro, at this point, I go to my edit menu, and the band's like, "Oh, that's great. Yeah, let's go on to the next song." I'm like, "Okay, I can now just build a template, and we'll just say, okay, just say January 18. You can name it whatever you want it to. And then at that point, you can just hit OK. And then when you go to do the next project, you just come here and say, okay, I just want to come here to more. And then we could just say, create. We can have a new folder. And then we go to town. And then all the naming, everything is automatically kind of set up for you as it was with the same mixer settings, with the same plugins, and same routing. So again, if you wanted to make a macro to easily kind of do a template, and that will save all the mixer settings for you. Again, what I did is, and this is just under key commands, and this is another viable method to do it, and we'll show you the steps in the macro again, where it's build template from project. So that way you do file, we can do is save as a new version. So the original is always intact. It's not affected. We select all the files, delete them so that it's not every time we start a new project, it doesn't carry over the audio files. From the pool, we select remove unused media, and then we choose save as template. And you could also just save it as a new project if you wanted to. And then just in a matter of seconds, you could be up and running with all your different files saved. So that's kind of an easy way of doing it. We had a question: how can you automatically create a MIDI file, opening up the right sounds from like Hallian or Hallian Sonic? So it's a preference. So as soon as you go to preferences and we go to MIDI file, here we could actually just have it automatically go to MIDI tracks, instrument tracks, and the default setting is to the general MIDI of the Hallian Sonic SE multi-timbral. So it's just a preference, and that will load up like the appropriate general MIDI sounds if the MIDI file is using general MIDI as the kind of specification. So once again, under preferences, MIDI file, and on the import options, just choose the Hallian Sonic SE multi-timbral. So that will open up the Hallian Sonic SE. It's the same general MIDI sounds that would be in Hallian or Hallian Sonic as well. So. Just read through some of your questions. Thanks everyone for great questions. All right, just going through. I scrolled down too far. I'm just getting back to where I was. Sorry for we have a lot of great questions coming up. So I'm seeing a comment about curve being used for clip automation, like some of the new Bezier curves. So I'll pass that on. I know they're aware of it. Okay, so I'm just saying, what's the best practice for sending MIDI tracks to BFD3? Is really, if it's an existing MIDI track, you probably want to load it as an instrument rack. So let's say if I just do Groove Agent, which is a drum program, I don't have BFD3. But at this point, you could now just send the particular track directly out to Groove Agent or directly out to BFD3. So if you have an existing MIDI track, you probably want to create a VST instrument in the rack, and then you could just assign that rack directly, send that track that has the MIDI data directly out to BFD3 as your instrument there. Okay, so we had a question about setting a MIDI command to control room volume. Um, and then if we come here, we could go to your studio setup. And I think you might be able to do it with generic remote. So if we come here, we can say we're going to take this MIDI message. And let's see if we go to the VST control room. And then what we want to do, select control room volume, and then that generic remote that's set up here will then be set, whatever MIDI controller here will be set to the control room volume of that particular fader. So this is the incoming MIDI message and this is what it's controlling. So again, choose VST control room, uh, choose the control room there, and then you could choose volume just like that. I saw someone's comment earlier that it kept losing the generic remote setup, so I haven't encountered that. Um, but if anyone else has run into that, let me know, and I could look into it a little further. So a question, why does the mixer undo sometimes stop working? I've experienced that myself. Hopefully it's going to be addressed soon. So I've seen on some projects where the mixer undo history kind of gets lost. So hopefully maybe the next maintenance update will resolve that. I haven't heard for sure, but I know they're aware of it. Okay, so I say in comment that maybe my Cubase volume isn't loud enough, so we'll go ahead and I'll turn that up a little bit. So I had a question: why isn't there any like quick groups in the mixer? Um, there is. So let's say if I have a number of different tracks here, and I wanted to assign those to a group, I could just right click on the selected channel, and then you say add group channels to selected channels. We'll make it a stereo group. And now our group is created with all those routings done. So again, just select whatever channels that you want. You could right click and then add group channel to selected channels. And you could do a keyboard shortcut for that as well. Okay, so I had a question in Groove Agent about using the note repeat, and I think they want to record the note repeat back into the pattern. I don't think it's set up for that. I think it's more of a performance real time thing. So I don't think we could record that directly back into itself as MIDI data. So it's kind of treating it a bit like an arpeggiator. So I don't know of a way to capture that MIDI back in. But it can follow. So I don't think it's designed to do that. So it's more of a performance tool as opposed to being able to kind of internally capture it. But so I don't think it works that way. Sorry. I just going through some of the questions that were submitted, and then we'll go back through some of the ones earlier. So we have a question: will Haydn's Symphony Orchestra work in 64-bit mode? Yes, it does. And basically, what they created was a Haydn Symphonic Orchestra sound set, and that plays inside of Haydn Sonic SE, Haydn Sonic, or Haydn. So this is playing back the sounds, the content are playing back through the 64-bit host. So make sure that you have the Haydn Symphonic Orchestra sound set, and then everything will work, very happily in 64-bit. All right, so we got a question. Can you condense tracks together in Cubase to save on CPU usage? Yeah, you could definitely do that. There's a couple different ways to do that. If you have, virtual instruments, a lot of people will choose to, freeze tracks. It's kind of one easy way of doing it. Taking virtual instruments, and they often can be the most taxing on a computer. You could also do really handy stuff like, okay, I have this part and this part, and now I want to just choose to, you could just say, okay, I just wanted to render these in place. And at this point, you could just turn these into audio files. Um, so as you do this, we could, keep it dry, we could include the inserts, channel strips, and EQs, or the send effects. And now we could just simply come here. If I wanted to just render like those two clips, it would mute the original MIDI and just give me audio files directly underneath, and even copy the color over. And we had another question that someone had asked, whether it was about that they have a particular instrument that's loading, that's gonna, if they have one particular instance, and then it's going to, if they have 16 outputs on, it's going to give you a bunch of unnecessary channels. So in the render in place, so let's say if we just come here, if you have it set to, go directly to all your outs, you may just want to, before quickly rendering, you could obviously delete the tracks, and it's kind of a quirky thing. But if we come directly to like the outputs, you could choose kind of what outputs are active, and it's going to be based on the output. So before you render in place, you may just want to turn off the outputs that are not being used for that particular track. I know that kind of sucks, but that's just kind of how it works now. So that will allow you to not have 15 empty unused files. So something to be kind of aware of. So we had a question about mix console with always on top. I think that's gone away. So but a lot of people, have done this, where since the mix console, a lot of it can be directly docked, find the need not to do it as much. So I think the thinking was that since it's could always be visible, you don't have to kind of fight for window space. That was kind of a better option to have it docked here, and that's why the option was removed. But I understand if it's frustrating for you. All right, so someone's asking for the best way to clear automation. So let's say if I have just a bunch of automation on a particular project. So let's say I have volume automation here. And let's say I just want to come to my panner. So I have all sorts of automation going on here. So I think if you hit F6, then you can open up the automation editor. And let's say if I select a track, one of the functions will be, if you come here, maybe you could, I think it's just to, if you go to the functions, you could just say delete automation on selected tracks. Then all the automation I just drew in is eradicated. Okay. Someone was asked a question about loading in um, to load new tracks into a saved template. So if you come here, um, so let's say I start off with a template. All right. So here's my template. All right. So you could just add a new track um, directly here. So say, okay, I just wanted to name this kick and do that. Now, what I think you might want to do is perhaps, like, let's say if we have a project, like or a track from another project, one of the things you could do is to import tracks from project. So let's say if I wanted to go to, let's say, a quick project from another song. Let's say if I wanted to import a kick drum from a different project. So I wanted to just come here. Let's say this is my project. I could select the project. And then what you could actually do is you could actually say, okay, I wanted to take the kick and I wanted to replace the kick from this project and place it into this particular project. So now when I hit OK, at that point, that kick drum can automatically be copied over, and it does it kind of as a new track version as well. So if I wanted to look at that, um, whatever function. So before I didn't have the studio EQ or the reference, so those are carried over from the other projects. I think that maybe what you're trying to ask, but if not, just let me know. Thanks everyone for your patience. I know we have a lot of questions to get through, so we're just trying to plow through them as quickly as we can. Appreciate all the wonderful questions. Okay, so getting back to the drum notation. Let me just see if we can do this quickly. Okay, so when I come here, so let's just, but you could also just kind of double click on the note itself and just change the note head shape. So it's probably not a great drum part, but try experimenting with your different note head shapes just by double clicking on the note itself and see if that does a trick. All right, so we had a question: how can you make like an audio loop that's being processed through two different through a group channel? How can you do that? So just do this. So say we have this drum loop and another drum loop. And let's say we have these going to our group channel. So I'll go to my mix console. And we'll add a group channel based on those selected tracks. And let's say I just wanted to EQ, did horrible EQ, and I want to run it through my channel strip. So let's say I wanted to have my envelope shaper and maybe just another plugin. So run through like a brick wall limiter. So if I wanted to just take this and export it, all I'd have to do is I'm going to set like my left and right locators. Then I choose to export audio mix down. And then at that point, I could just do my stereo out. And if I had multiple tracks that I wanted to exclude, I could just solo those particular tracks. And then when I export, I could export it as my audio track. I'll put it directly back into the system, into the project, and now we'll cancel this. And then we could have our drum loop automatically show up here. And I have it set to split the files. So I'll just undo that. So if someone wanted to take a particular file that was stereo, and this was another question that we had emailed in, is, how can we split that? So we could just simply select it and go to your export audio mix down. And then it's kind of perhaps a little goofy workaround, but you could just choose to split the channels. But if I just wanted to do kind of my left, right channels, I could just now solo those. And at this point, I could export it as whatever name that I wanted to. And then that would be a stereo file that could be directly inside of my project that I could have access to from in MediaBay. So I could take it multiple drum loops, do group processing, and then have that as a separate file that I could use in subsequent projects or sell as different drum loops. So we had a question about a different spectrum analyzer function, like kind of what we see in WaveLab, and some people are using frequency EQ to do that. So I've had discussions with developers of maybe incorporating some of those elements in. I will kind of pass it on again, but it's currently kind of more spectral metering is going to be kind of a part of WaveLab. Some people will kind of just select an audio file, and this is kind of probably very dated. Let me see if it still even does it. But let me just. And while I don't think it's real time, but there isn't currently a selection that's kind of, like WaveLab and Cubase, but I'll mention it. Just reading through a question. Thanks for everyone's patience. All right, so I had a question about adding inputs, and maybe if you forgot an input, if you could add one kind of in the middle. So let's take a quick look. So we'll get to our audio connections, and I'll just start with kind of a stereo out or stereo in, and let's say 8 mono ins. Okay, and let's say at this point I wanted to add a bus. It looks like, let's see if I select. It looks like it's only going to kind of add it at the end. But you could just reassign the input here and rename it, but it looks like it gets added at the end and you can't really add it in the middle. Sorry about that. I see a question. Can I open an unsaved project due to a computer shutdown? One of the things that you can do is actually, depending on your preferences, by default, Cubase will do auto saves in the background. I believe it's under general. So if we kind of come here under general, you could have the auto save, which I believe is on by default. So you may be able to recover kind of, and that could be within the project folder, like a .bak file, like a backup. So if you have that set up, but if you didn't have that turned on, it may be hard to recover if your computer crashed. So just, but give that a try and see if you have any backups. So again, if you go to your preferences and come over here to general, you just turn off autosave or turn it on, make sure it's on. All right, someone asked about why your audio files have different tempos in the project, and maybe that's why you're not allowing them to, uh, do tempo detection correctly. When I've seen that is when people sometimes have, if you try having your master timeline, make sure your master timeline is set to bars and beats as opposed to seconds. If you kind of know but that's going to be kind of independent of the tempo detection. Um, but I've seen that happen once in a while with someone who just, maybe switched tempos and then, their master timeline was in seconds or time code as opposed to bars and beats. So try working in bars and beats and see if that makes a difference. But if they're all recorded at the same tempo, you could go into the pool and just reassign the tempo. And then as long as it's kind of the right tempo, it should work for you. And again, that would be independent of the tempo detection. So. So we have a question. Is there anything kind of like vocal line, and then kind of asking about we've seen that kind of functionality incorporated in Nuendo 8, and we may see it kind of trickle its way down to Cubase where it makes sense. But then we have a question about MIDI stuff, being able to see different parts within as a reference. So let's say if I just jump to this particular project and let me activate this, you could just select multiple MIDI events and be able to edit them kind of intelligently. So let's say if I come here and I wanted to see uh, this bass and guitar part, at that point, if I just choose to edit these, at that point, I could just say, okay, let's go directly to my key editor. And we could actually colorize these based on different parts. So at this point, I could see the reference of one part, as different colors and how they kind of overlap. And if you wanted to, there's different, sorry about that. You could choose to only edit the active part only so that you don't accidentally, move, so at this point you could choose to, edit which part. So you can say, okay, I just wanted to see the fretless bass. And if I have the edit active part only, I can't move the guitar arpeggios. I'm only seeing this. So if you wanted to just kind of select different parts, you could choose which ones could be edited and which one could be used as a frame of reference. But in terms of kind of like vocal alignment, again, that was just introduced in Nuendo, and I think we may see it, but I could only speculate if it would come into Nuendo in the future or in Cubase in the future. But they've obviously developed the technology. So question, is it standard protocol to have a brick wall limiter on your bus channel? A lot of mastering engineers wouldn't like you to do that if you're passing it on to them. A lot of people do it because it's kind of what people are comparing to, other references. So a lot of people do it. A lot of mastering engineers would ask that you not do it so that they could have a stab at it. But it is common if you're doing the whole project to completion yourself. All right. So question was, some manufacturers have dedicated mono or dedicated stereo plugins, and that kind of goes back to like older plugin technologies, because like VST3, part of that is the plugin can adapt to whatever channel configuration you're in, but some earlier DAWs, would not allow you to do that. So that's kind of why you have that distinction. But if you wanted to do it, it's more for kind of third party DAWs that don't automatically change the mixer routing depending on the channel width. Okay, so we had a question about saving a song, and why does it always save into an untitled folder? And the thing that I would recommend when you're starting projects is, when you get to the Steinberg hub, by default you see this use default location. It puts into your project folder, and you probably uh, don't actually name the folder here. It's really easy to just kind of click through this very quickly. So one is to name your folder here. I like to actually have it prompt me for the project location. So if I say create empty, it's now going to ask me what folder, and I define the folder, and think of defining each folder, each project or each song as a new folder. And that way all of your file management will make sense. But when you start a new project, if you go into the default location, just make sure that right here in the hub, and if you do this, that you just name the folder, and then that will keep kind of your file management much more streamlined, where you don't run into that. So the question is, can you import ACID files into Cubase? Yes. Uh, and so, someone mentioned that you could, we need a delete all controller function. You could do that from the logical editor. Just come directly here in the logical editor. And, when you go to, let's say I select the MIDI part here so we could open a logical editor. At this part, I could just say MIDI controllers equal, and then I really could just say, so we could just come right here. Let me just clear this. And we say we want to delete, type is equal to controller, and then just hit apply. And that would delete every single controller. All right. So we had a question from Liverpool about taking like a groove agent part from one project and applying it into another. It's, really all you have to do. I think we have some like a groove agent track here is, you could just simply drag and drop, into one project into another project, just like that. Or you could just come right over here and import tracks from project. And that would carry over, choose your project. And then, so let's say I just choose this as my project. You then see all of your different prod tracks that you could import directly in. So I could say I wanted the, groove agent and then just simply import that particular project or that particular track. Just go through questions. Sorry, a lot of questions. Okay, so we got a question on the drum map being able to change the view. So let me just jump back. So you want to do low notes at top. So if I just come directly here to, let's say, a project. So I'll just create my drum map from the instrument. And now as soon as I come here, we could go to our drum editor. And then again, within the drum visibility tabs, you could reverse the drum order list if you wanted to. So if we just look at this, I could show all the drum sounds or show drum sounds that are only used. So show all drum sounds. And now at this point, you could just reverse or flip the direction of the drum sounds like that. So we had kind of a joking question: how can you get Simon Phillips to record a click click for your drum track? All you have to do is buy the Simon Phillips library. So if you just kind of come directly to Groove Agent, there's a whole Simon Phillips library. It's really good. So we have a question: will there be a selective undo? A lot of the functions will be linear based, but for audio processing, you have the direct offline processing, and that's non-linear based. But for a lot of the edits, it's still going to be linear based. So, see a question, someone just logged in. If they could just ask a question, just enter it in the comments field. We're trying to get through as many as we can. We have a lot of great questions today. Okay, so a couple of comments on like color schemes. Can we get a lighter color scheme? You may notice that my MIDI is a bit brighter, and this is just a preference. So if you just kind of come directly to your preferences, you can go to different color schemes here. So you could choose color schemes. If you wanted to go to, focus colors, project, area background, you could just click here and then you could change the different colors as you see fit and customize it. I like to have the MIDI editors a bit brighter for contrast, maybe because my eyes are terrible. So I choose to have my MIDI editors brighter like previous versions. So like in 8.5. So when to do that, I just go to my editors. So as soon as I come here, I can say, okay, let's go to my custom color schemes, and I could just click on editors, and you may notice that my editors are brighter than the default ones. So those can be customized. So if you feel it's dark and gloomy, it's actually so that you can work on it for longer periods of times without kind of eye strain. But it could be just switched very easily. Okay, so we had a quick question on how to add like shuffle to MIDI. Like if you want a particular drum groove, one of the great plugins that you can have is if you go to MIDI inserts, and what you could do is there's a plugin called the quantizer plugin, and this has a swing feel, and you could just adjust kind of the swing. So you could go from very suburban to urban, if you will. So at that point, if you want kind of that new jack swing, Teddy Riley feel, you could just kind of move that all the way over to the right. But that will take your existing MIDI information. It won't alter it unless you choose to record it. And then if you have something that's a little sterile, you could then just simply add more swing to it there. And we also had a couple questions on a control room. Let me read those. Okay, so let's say if we wanted to do a quick cue mix for the control room, we'll just go to our mixer here, and the singer wants to hear, let's say, more of themselves. So I'm going to activate my control room on the right side of the mixer by clicking here. And we can now go make sure that in the racks that you have the cue sends checked and maybe turned off by default. But now what you could do is you could select like all the different channels here of this particular project. I'm going to select all those. And what I want to do is to right click in the control rooms, and I want to just go to from the selected channels. And what I want to do is first enable the cue sends. And I could do this on all the different, you have 4 different cue mixes at once. So, but now if I wanted to come here and say I want to use the current mix levels. So often the singer wants to, the musicians want more me. So what this is sending more of the signal directly into the tracks themselves. So if this was the vocal, we could actually just send more of the vocal into the cue mix without affecting the main mix here. And if you have like 4 tracks of drums, each drum you could send different amounts into the different amounts of each drum into the cue mix, and each, the singer, guitarist, bassist, drummer could all have independent cue mixes as they're recording, and that's saved with the project, which is really helpful. Okay, so it's kind of a common question. I recorded, my SM58 into my, and in this case, is a UR44 audio interface. So make sure that you have the gain structure set. When you look at, your waveform, that it's full here as you recorded the signal. So you may have to adjust the gain structure so that you get here. Now, when you go to export an audio file for like an MP3, you know, the one thing that's really critical is like where your master fader is at, because if you're using this as a monitoring volume, what often happens is, like, let's say here we're at minus 20 some, let's say we're at minus 20 dB. When we go to export, it drops the volume down by 20 dB because you told it to. So try to make sure that your monitoring level is good at where you're at, let's say, near 0 dB on your master fader. And that way you won't get kind of an inadvertent volume drop when you export your MP3 file. All right. So the question, how do you normalize songs in Cubase? It's really just normalizing audio files. And you could just right click and go to select the files in the project, right click, and if you go to processes, and then you'll have your normalize directly right there, and you can set the normalizing amount. So you could just simply do that for all the files, and then if you wanted to, undo that after, this is where you can kind of do a direct level of, where we could just have, again, non-linear undos with the undo history. But it's really just going to your audio menu and then going to processes, and then you have normalize right there. Question, where will the video be archived? It's going to be on the Cubase YouTube channel, and there's a whole playlist of these Google Hangouts. So we got a question, and it's kind of related to Wavelab, but it's also applicable to Cubase, like importing a 16-bit 44.1 file if it's actually, um, excuse me, do you benefit, I believe, from the 32-bit floating point? So as soon as you do processing, it'll play back as a 16-bit 44.1 file. But as you do, if you add EQs, you adjust the volume like 1/1000th of a dB, it's then, being altered in the audio engine so that it's being all the processing is in 32-bit or 64-bit double precision, processing. So you will get a benefit from it, especially if you, are doing any processing whatsoever. So a question, can you select multiple audio events and do VariAudio? So yeah, and what's kind of cool about it is, let's say if I'm here, let's say I've done, like at this point I have chord tracks, and let's say I create harmonies. So let's say I have these 5 parts here, and at that point I could just simply select multiple parts like this. And then when you go into the VariAudio editor, I'll go into my sample editor and select VariAudio. Then we could just have it do the analysis. I could see all of my different parts, and I could select one voice at a time and do editing and move it around if I wanted to, select a different voice. So whatever parts you select, you can see multiple tracks within the VariAudio editor. Yes, so we got a question, kind of like a stereo track to mono, for more punch. It doesn't necessarily give you more punch, but if you wanted to, you could just, if you have like a drum loop in here, and let's say I have this, I could, one of the tools that you could do is just simply, as an insert on this particular track, let's say we go to our track, and if you go to the inserts, and let's say you go to, under spatial, and let's say if you do I think it's the mono to stereo, and then if you just choose, the width to be 0, that makes it very mono. You could also just within that particular file, if you go to, your media, and let's say we go to our pool window, and I could take this particular drum loop, right click, and go to, um, I think there's sorry, convert files, and then you could just switch the channels to mono if you wanted to. So that's another option. But I so either one of those things will get you there. So we had a question: could you fade in with the offline processing like earlier versions? So if I just wanted to take this drum loop that I have selected here, I could, kind of works the same way. So if I just wanted to select the top there, and let's say I just choose processes and just choose fade in, and let's say I just wanted to make it more of a straight fade in, or so every time I do this, it's automatically just applying my different fades accordingly. So yeah, it works the same exact way as it did previously. And then if you wanted to, I could just delete that offline process. Just going through some of the questions. Again, lots of questions. Thanks. Sorry for not going to get to all of them today. So we have a question: if I import a WAV file twice, will Cubase automatically rename the next one? No, because it's the same file. But if you wanted to treat it independently, all you have to do is, literally just kind of, if I have that same file, it's the same audio file on a hard drive. But if you wanted to be independent, just go to your audio menu and choose bounce selection, and then choose to replace the file. That will create a new file that will function independently of the original file. But copying the same file will allow you to, it's not going to automatically rename the file. All right, so I got a comment on the Steinberg hub. Why is this so gigantic? A lot of it is to make sure, when a lot of times people are just starting off, this is a great place for them to start off. And it also can, if you're looking for trial versions, you're looking for quick start, you're looking for new features, looking for tutorial videos, it kind of allows us to kind of be able to communicate effectively. But we wanted to be kind of friendly for first time users, especially. So I understand if you think it's a little big, but it does a lot of stuff for someone starting off. So there's a question about can you swing audio as well? One of the things you could do is you could actually kind of take a drum loop. So let's say if I had this drum loop and I wanted to go to my sample editing functions here, and let's say I go to my hit points. At this point, we could kind of select the threshold for hit points, and then you could actually just create groove from that. So then you could apply that and kind of quantize other audio parts as well. So you can make both MIDI and audio swing. So we had a question if there was a note repeat function in Cubase. Within Cubase there isn't, but within Groove Agent, which is our drum tool, and this is not in the included Groove Agent SE, but in the full Groove Agent, there's a performance area, and this is where you could do all of your different note repeats and be able to trigger them with different presets. So if you wanted to just say, I want it, different velocities, different rhythmic values from quarter and a triplet to, whatever value. So within Groove Agent, within the our drum tool, there's very sophisticated note repeat functionality. So you see a question about not scrubbing MIDI information, but audio, you're doing a half speed. MIDI is firing off the node, so it's not going to scrub like audio. But if you could do stuff, within samplers to do that, but it's kind of two different realms. So move on. Next question. So we had a question if there's a quick tape stop effect. So one of the plugins that you get with Cubase, and it's under other, is loop mash effects. And in here, there's different tape stop effects that you could employ and use. So we had a question about reducing the latency for the performer. So there's a couple things that you could do. One is as you're, is to minimize the latency on the buffer, and we can do this in the studio setup. So if I come here, let's say to my Steinberg UR44 interface, which I'm using, I could adjust my buffer size lower. So that's one thing to do. Now, also in a VST audio system, we could run your ASIO guard level. So if you have a lot of different things, you may want to adjust that, make sure that it's on, or you may want to set that to high. So that will be able to have kind of a multiple scale where just the active recording track could be running at lower latencies. And some audio interfaces like the UR44 are designed to do, all of, you actually have an audio hardware setup. And here you could have onboard, reverbs and delays that could be employed in the channel strip. So if I just wanted to come directly here, I could access these different. When I go to my, I'll just go to my racks and we'll say, let's go to, your audio. We'll just say all of your racks. And then once it's assigned in the inputs, we could. Now, let me just go to my inputs and I'll just choose, let's say, input one here. And now I could just go to my hardware settings. And as soon as I go to, the hardware settings, at that point, I could have, sorry, that's, Just find the right project here. Sorry about that. But in the hardware settings, you could have all of your different windows automatically kind of carried over into your hardware settings so that you could adjust compression and reverb without having to use the software, because when you use like a software reverb, that's going to impose latency. But a lot of the Steinberg interfaces from the UR242 up will actually have the onboard DSP, so that makes it a lot easier for a vocalist to deal with. So if we're in a typical routing scenario, we could just go directly to our audio hardware here, and then once that is set up, I'll just go to my audio connections, and I will set up just a quick UR44 input, and then at that point I could see my onboard reverb that will be just like a digital mixer, because the DSP is on the audio interface itself. Okay, with that, we've gone a little over 3 hours. I'm sorry that we had some of the questions earlier that didn't get answered. I will try to I will keep them for a list for the next hangout. But I want to thank everyone. I'm going to have to go pick up my son from school. But I want to thank everyone for participating in Hangout throughout from everywhere in the world. It's always a joy to me. I just wanted to make sure that everyone's learning some stuff. I think right after, we have the NAMM show coming up here in the US, and I think maybe the last day of January, we're going to be able to squeeze in another hangout on the Wednesday. So I'll get it posted. This hangout will be available online to be viewed. I hope that everyone has learned a couple of good tips and tricks. If you have questions that you want to submit in advance, you could send it to Club Cubase at steinberg.net. And once again, it's a joy to have such great questions and to kind of virtually meet every one of you throughout the world. We hope that, again, you learn stuff. And we do these about twice a month is what we average. We kind of stopped one over Christmas because I lost my voice, as you may have heard on the last hangout. So I rested up my voice so I could get through it. But we just want to make sure that you're getting as much out of the software as you can. And thank you so much. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. I'll just see if there's any closing super fast questions before we end. All right, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. And if you like the video, again, you can always subscribe to the Cubase YouTube channel, and we'll have these available for you guys to watch. Thanks again, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. And appreciate all of your support.